These characters just slowly started coming to life, but that was because it was creator-owned, and so it was kind of my voice, and I didn't necessarily have, I didn't have 70 years of continuity to lean on and say, oh, well, they've gone through this and come back from the dead. So, you know, I'm finding it's very different for creator-owned versus my superhero stuff, and honestly, each script is still different for me because honestly, I've been doing this full time for 6 months, and as far as comics goes, and then, but part time for about a year now.
And Jim, let me break you there. So let Paul jump in.
Sure. Over the years, I've used every version of this, and everything that everyone is saying is right on some day. Most frequently these days, I'm working with a pad first to write out the 5 or 6 ideas, crumple them up, the things I want the story to accomplish, what romance is going on, what horrific plot is going on, and kind of get my ideas so I have my core thing. Often I will start with a title or a line that is a punchline for it. Much of the first Legion arc was done around the last line of issue 5, because I just wanted to write, how can you be sleeping with that racist pig?
Paul, do you approach it differently when you're doing a large cast book as opposed to a single character book?
Sure. I mean, Legion obviously has much more of the, I've got 4 or 5 streams running at the same time. I did an 8-page spirit story recently, which was very, very tightly constrained. It was very much, in many ways, Aristotelian unities. It was about a newsstand owner, and the entire thing took place in front of the newsstand in Central City, and the characters who go by and the interaction with the spirits. So you didn't have any of that dynamic. And to your point about each page, that was paced to be 8 days or 7 days, played to it in the progression of the snowstorm that was happening that would eventually be a piece of it. So there it was pure beat sheet. I'll usually go to a beat sheet maybe when I'm about half or 2/3 through the story, and I just want to make sure that I got enough room left to do all the things, so let me make sure everything's there. Being the old person who wrote on typewriters, one of the joys of writing now on a word processor is it's relatively easy compared to the old days to go back in and adjust your length and say, oh, I got room to make that scene an extra page and play the panels longer. Oops, it's 20 instead of 22. Okay, they don't really need an appendix. Can we get rid of the left arm without doing too much harm? And you go back in and you make your nips and tucks. It all works. It's what works for you and what works for the project. As Ron says, you don't do it the same for different sorts of things. I've written stories where there was a legendary writer in the business named Tom Gill, one of the most prolific writers in the business. And Tom would start a story not knowing how long it was, forget what the assignment was, he'd be 3-4 pages into it, wander into the editor's office and say, how many pages did you need? 5, Tom. Okay. Go back and write the last 2 pages. And most of the time it made sense. It wasn't the highest standard of craft. What you're shooting to do, what pressure you feel is on you. As Neil was doing Sandman, the books took longer and longer to write. He was a better and better writer as he did it, but everyone was saying, oh my God, this is art. This is the most important comic you will ever write, Neil. And he's got a strong enough ego, he ignored about half of it, maybe 90% of it. But his standard for the little voice in him that Ron was talking about got pretty tough and bitchy. So by the time he was done, it was about 3 weeks to write a Sandman script. They're really fucking good. But even Neil Gaiman, having now had a decade of being a comics writer and having achieved as much craft as he had, as well as the intrinsic talent that he's got, was slowing down to just do it more carefully.
And I think at least for me, it doesn't, the more you do it, it doesn't really get easier. I mean, you know more about the craft, but because you know more about the craft, your standards are higher, and you know, it takes me longer now than it did literally 20 years ago to write a script, because I know, I frankly know what's shit and what isn't now. So, so you.
I don't know about. I've seen that go both ways. I mean,
well, I think it's easier because you know more about what you're doing, but I think there's also
it's definitely more demanding.
A difficulty because you know more about what you're doing. Yeah.
To expect more as I go forward. I haven't done a lot of continuity comics where they continue on and on. I tend to have beginnings, middles, and ends, and I usually start with the beginning and have an end, and I fill in the middle. Sometimes it changes, like I see Terracotta Warriors and realize that I'm totally wrong where I was going with the story. So I do that. I usually break it down by book. I then break it down by page. Pretty basic layouts. I just say, Miss Lion pees on a tree, Frog Thor uses his hammer, and the next page this. And then I actually go back in and do panel by panel by panel, all the way through the book, and then I go through and do the dialogue. And what I find myself doing is, as I'm doing dialogue, I realize I can cut panels here and there, or I need to add one, or I need to showcase this one line of dialogue and give it some weight more, or add a splash page to really sell that moment.
Hey, so while you're at it, can I just jump in? Chris is also a mega award-winning letterer, and he also draws the books. How did lettering color what you do with dialogue?
Oh, and I remember a story, I think it was about Franklin, who worked with type in a newspaper, and he had a tactile feeling for type and learned, or maybe it was Twain, it might have been Twain, I might be wrong.
Maybe it was Chaucer.
I don't know. See, I told you research.
I totally thought you meant Franklin Richards for a minute.
No, Benjamin. I'm sorry. But I think it was Twain, and he tended to have to work the type, and he heard the voice of the type as he went, and I tended to do the same thing. When you're working with people like Brian Bendis and Joss Whedon, Ed Brubaker, and all these great talented people throughout the year, and I've worked with Alan Moore, you get a feeling when you're actually lettering what they wrote, and you follow it, and there's a weird thing. I would recommend any writer to become a letterer first. Robert Kirkman was lettering stuff before he actually started writing. So for me, it was a great advanced course for me.
There's another way to build that skill too, if your hand isn't steady enough for it. In the dinosaur age, before electronic lettering, either the writer or the artist had to lay the balloons in on everything. And typically in those old days, you laid in letter by letter the copy, even though you weren't lettering it, but you were placing it that way to see that the balloon fit the right space. It's a wonderful exercise to do with art, both to get stronger at your sense of balloon placement, which is a powerful, important writing tool that many in comics that many writers don't do properly or understand. Some of us old bastards still insist on balloon placing our own stories. But just learning to do that, you will begin, the amount of time you're forced to spend handwriting it, you will get a sense of that voice, you'll get a sense of the punchline. This balloon shouldn't be 2 sentences. This balloon has to be 1 sentence. This balloon can be 2 because this is 2 pieces of speech. You'll hear the pauses. Churchill used to do a thing. Those famous speeches that he used to deliver, that he's legendary for, were handwritten out on index cards.